"You're just a burden," Mom cried. So I revealed I'd been anonymously paying her mortgage. The stack of medical bills trembled in Sarah's hands as her mother's voice cut through the silence like a blade. "You're just a burden, Sarah. Always have been. I should have known better than to think you'd actually help when things got tough." The words landed with the precision of a surgeon's scalpel, finding every insecurity Sarah had carried for 32 years. Standing in the cramped kitchen of her childhood home in Millbrook, surrounded by peeling wallpaper and the persistent smell of her mother's menthol cigarettes, Sarah felt something inside her chest crack open. Not her heart. That had been breaking incrementally for months. This was something deeper. The final fracture of a foundation built on decades of conditional love and emotional manipulation. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Her mother, Eleanor Mitchell, sat hunched over the kitchen table, her graying hair pulled back in the same severe bun she'd worn for as long as Sarah could remember. The medical bills were spread before her like tarot cards predicting financial doom, each one stamped with the logo of Millbrook General Hospital, where Eleanor had spent 3 weeks recovering from emergency gallbladder surgery. The irony wasn't lost on Sarah that these bills, these pieces of paper that had driven her mother to such cruel desperation, had already been paid. Every single one. Anonymously, by the daughter Eleanor was now calling a burden. Sarah Elizabeth Mitchell had learned early that love in the Mitchell household came with conditions. Born to Eleanor and James Mitchell in the small industrial town of Millbrook, Pennsylvania, she grew up understanding that affection was earned through achievement, and disappointment was met with withdrawal of warmth that could last for days. Her father, a machinist at the local steel plant, had died in an industrial accident when Sarah was 16, leaving behind a modest life insurance policy and a widow who viewed his death as the ultimate abandonment. Eleanor had always been a woman who measured worth in tangible contributions. When James died, she immediately began calculating how much Sarah cost versus how much she brought to the household. The girl's part-time job at the grocery store barely covered her school expenses, and Eleanor made sure she knew it. "Food doesn't put itself on this table" became Eleanor's favorite refrain, usually delivered while Sarah was attempting to study for her college entrance exams. Despite the emotional minefield at home, Sarah excelled academically. She had discovered early that books were refuge, that mathematics had clean answers, and that computer programming offered a logical world where problems had solutions. Her high school guidance counselor, Mrs. Rodriguez, had pulled her aside during senior year with applications to several universities, complete with scholarship opportunities that could cover full tuition. "You have options, Sarah," Mrs. Rodriguez had said, spreading the applications across her desk like a map to freedom. "Your grades in mathematics and computer science are exceptional. These scholarships could take you anywhere you want to go." But Eleanor had other plans. "College is a luxury we can't afford," she announced when Sarah brought the scholarship applications home. "You need to start contributing properly to this household. The Hendersons down the street said they'd hire you full-time at their cleaning service. That's real work that pays real money." Sarah had filled out the applications in secret, using the school's computer lab during lunch periods and after school hours. When the acceptance letter arrived from Pennsylvania State University, along with a full scholarship for computer science, she hid it in her bedroom for 3 days before finding the courage to share the news. Eleanor's reaction was predictable in its devastation. "So you're abandoning me too," she had said, her voice flat with accusation. "First your father leaves me to deal with everything alone, and now my own daughter thinks she's too good for her family?" The manipulation was masterful in its simplicity. Eleanor didn't forbid Sarah from going to college, she simply made it emotionally impossible. Every day leading up to the scholarship deadline became a fresh opportunity to remind Sarah of her selfishness. "I suppose I'll just have to figure out how to pay these bills by myself," Eleanor would mutter while sorting through mail. "But don't worry about your old mother, I'm sure I'll manage somehow."
The guilt campaigns intensified when Eleanor began having what she called episodes, sudden chest pains that required Sarah to drive her to the emergency room, only to be told by doctors that her heart was fine, dizzy spells that coincided suspiciously with Sarah's study sessions, memory lapses that somehow never affected Eleanor's ability to recall every sacrifice she'd made for her ungrateful daughter. 3 weeks before the scholarship deadline, Eleanor had her first real medical emergency, a severe asthma attack that landed her in the hospital for 2 days. Sarah spent both nights sleeping in an uncomfortable chair beside her mother's bed, watching the monitors and feeling the weight of genuine fear. When Eleanor recovered, her first words weren't gratitude for Sarah's vigil, but a reminder of how precarious her health had become. "The doctor said stress makes everything worse," Eleanor had whispered, her voice still hoarse from the breathing treatments. "I can't imagine what would happen to me if I had to worry about being completely alone on top of everything else." Sarah let the scholarship deadline pass. She told herself it was temporary, that she could reapply the following year, that community college was a stepping stone rather than a limitation. She got the job with the Henderson's cleaning service and began contributing her entire paycheck to household expenses, keeping only enough for bus fare and the occasional lunch. But Eleanor's definition of enough help proved to be a moving target. When Sarah suggested taking evening classes at the community college, Eleanor developed a mysterious back condition that required help with basic household tasks. When Sarah managed to save enough money for a used car, Eleanor's medical expenses suddenly increased, requiring Sarah's contribution to cover copays and medications. The pattern continued for 14 years. Sarah would make progress toward independence, and Eleanor would have a crisis that pulled her back into the role of caregiver and primary financial supporter. Sarah did eventually manage to take computer programming classes, but only part-time and only when Eleanor's health permitted. She changed jobs several times, gradually working her way up from cleaning services to data entry, then to junior programming positions at local businesses. By the time Sarah turned 30, she had developed significant skills in database management and web development, largely through self-teaching and online courses she completed during her lunch breaks and late evening hours when Eleanor was asleep. Her break came when Peterson Manufacturing, one of Millbrook's few remaining industrial employers, needed someone to overhaul their entire inventory management system. Sarah had proposed a complete digital transformation of their processes, creating a presentation on her personal laptop that she delivered to the company's board of directors. The project was ambitious enough to require someone with advanced programming skills, but small enough that they could hire locally rather than contracting with a large firm. Sarah's bid was accepted, and suddenly she found herself earning more money than she had ever imagined possible. The Peterson project led to other opportunities. Word spread through Millbrook's tight business community about the young woman who could solve complex technological problems at a fraction of the cost of big consulting firms. Sarah began taking on multiple clients, working evenings and weekends to build websites, create custom programs, and solve technical problems for all sorts of small businesses that couldn't afford permanent IT staff.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Inventory systems and modernize outdated business processes. Within 2 years, Sarah was earning enough to support herself comfortably while still contributing to Eleanor's household expenses. She rented a small apartment across town, furnished it modestly, and for the first time in her adult life, experienced the luxury of coming home to space that was entirely her own. No cigarette smell, no medical equipment cluttering the living room, no constant commentary about her shortcomings as a daughter. But freedom came with its own complications. Eleanor's health complaints intensified in direct proportion to Sarah's independence. Phone calls at all hours reporting symptoms that required immediate attention. Emergency room visits that inevitably occurred when Sarah had important work deadlines. A series of minor accidents and mishaps that seemed to require her constant availability. Sarah found herself living 2 lives. During business hours, she was a competent professional who solved problems and earned respect from clients who valued her expertise. After hours and on weekends, she was the perpetually inadequate daughter who could never do enough to satisfy her mother's endless needs. The breaking point began 3 months before that devastating afternoon in Eleanor's kitchen.
Sarah had been working on her largest project yet, a comprehensive e-commerce platform for a regional retail chain that would require 6 months of intensive development work. The contract was worth more money than she had ever earned, enough to finally build the kind of financial security that would allow her to plan for her own future. Eleanor's gallbladder surgery happened during the second week of the project. What should have been a routine procedure turned complicated when Eleanor developed an infection that required extended hospitalization and weeks of home recovery. Sarah suspended her work to become a full-time caregiver, sleeping on Eleanor's couch and managing medications, meals, and the constant stream of medical appointments. The retail client was understanding, but firm about their timeline. Sarah worked on the project in stolen moments between caregiving duties, programming late into the night while Eleanor slept, debugging code on her laptop in hospital waiting rooms. She managed to stay on schedule, but the stress of maintaining professional commitments while providing intensive care took its toll. During Eleanor's recovery, the medical bills began arriving. Even with Medicare coverage, the costs were overwhelming. The extended hospital stay, specialist consultations, prescription medications, and home health services created a mounting pile of invoices that Eleanor studied with increasing desperation. Sarah had immediately called the hospital's billing department to arrange payment plans, using her business credit card to cover the most urgent expenses while working out long-term arrangements for the larger bills. She never mentioned this to Eleanor, knowing that accepting help would be interpreted as another opportunity for guilt and manipulation. Instead, Sarah arranged for the payments to be processed anonymously through a third-party service commonly used for charitable donations. The hospital received payment in full for Eleanor's bills, but the documentation showed only that an anonymous benefactor had covered the expenses. Sarah thought this approach would allow Eleanor to maintain her pride while removing the financial stress that was clearly affecting her recovery. She had underestimated Eleanor's talent for finding new sources of anxiety and blame. Rather than feeling relief when the bills were mysteriously paid, Eleanor became convinced that some kind of administrative error had occurred. She spent hours on the phone with hospital billing representatives, demanding explanations for the payments and insisting that mistakes like this always came back to hurt people eventually. When assured that the payments were legitimate and no error had occurred, Eleanor developed a new theory. "Someone's playing games with me," she announced to Sarah during one of her daily check-in calls. "This is exactly the kind of thing your father's family would do to make me look foolish. They probably think I'll be grateful, but I know they're just waiting to throw it back in my face." James's family had actually been quite supportive after his death, but Eleanor had gradually alienated them with her suspicion and hostility. Sarah's aunts and uncles had stopped visiting years ago, tired of Eleanor's accusations and conspiracy theories. The idea that they would anonymously pay substantial medical bills was absurd, but Eleanor needed someone to blame for her discomfort with receiving help. The paranoia escalated over several weeks. Eleanor convinced herself that the anonymous payments were part of some elaborate scheme to manipulate her, possibly involving insurance fraud or identity theft. She filed reports with the police, contacted the state attorney general's office, and even hired a private investigator to discover the source of the payments. Sarah watched this spiral with growing frustration. She had solved Eleanor's financial crisis only to create a new emotional crisis based on Eleanor's inability to accept help gracefully. The irony was exhausting. She had spent her entire adult life providing financial support that Eleanor demanded and criticized simultaneously. Now, when she had found a way to help without triggering Eleanor's guilt-inducing responses, that anonymity had become the new source of distress. The situation reached its crisis point when the private investigator Eleanor had hired proved to be more competent than Sarah had expected. Within 3 weeks, he had traced the payments back to the third-party service, and from there to the business account Sarah used for client transactions. When Eleanor received his report, documenting exactly how the payments had been processed and by whom, her reaction wasn't gratitude or relief. It was rage. Sarah arrived at Eleanor's house that Tuesday afternoon, expecting their usual awkward visit filled with medical updates and subtle criticisms. Instead, she found Eleanor sitting at the kitchen table, surrounded by medical bills, the private investigator's report, and bank statements that Sarah recognized as her own financial records, somehow obtained through Eleanor's amateur detective work. "Sit down," Eleanor said, without looking up from the papers. Her voice carried the kind of cold authority that had terrified Sarah as a child, the tone that preceded the worst punishments and longest periods of silent treatment. Sarah remained standing, her hands still on the doorknob, suddenly aware that this conversation was going to be different from all the others that had come before. There was something in Eleanor's posture, in the way she had arranged the papers like evidence in a trial, that warned of an approaching storm she had no idea how to weather. "I said, sit down." Eleanor's voice didn't rise, but the command carried absolute certainty that it would be obeyed. Sarah moved to the chair across from her mother, the same seat she had occupied during homework supervision and disciplinary lectures throughout her childhood. The kitchen felt smaller than usual, the walls pressing closer as Eleanor finally lifted her eyes from the papers and fixed Sarah with a stare that held no warmth whatsoever. "Do you think I'm stupid?" Eleanor asked, her voice conversational in a way that made Sarah's stomach clench with familiar dread. "No, of course not. I don't understand what you mean." Eleanor picked up the private investigator's report and held it like a weapon. "This says you've been paying my medical bills behind my back, making me look like a fool who can't take care of herself." Sarah opened her mouth to explain, to share the good intentions behind her actions, but Eleanor continued without pause. "How long have you been lying to me, Sarah? How long have you been playing these games, pretending to be helpful while actually making me dependent on your charity?" The word charity was delivered with the kind of disdain Eleanor usually reserved for discussing welfare recipients and other people she considered morally deficient. Sarah felt the familiar weight of guilt settling on her shoulders, the automatic assumption that whatever was wrong must somehow be her fault. "I wasn't trying to make you dependent. I was trying to help. The bills were causing you so much stress, and I knew you were worried about money, so I thought if they were just taken care of quietly, you could focus on getting better." Eleanor laughed, a harsh sound that held no humor. "Focus on getting better? Is that what you call it when you sneak around behind someone's back making decisions about their life, treating them like a charity case?" Sarah tried to find words that would explain her motivations without triggering Eleanor's defensive responses, but 32 years of experience had taught her that no explanation would be sufficient when Eleanor was in this mood. The goal wasn't understanding, it was dominance. "I thought you'd be relieved," Sarah said quietly, knowing even as she spoke that relief had never been Eleanor's response to problems being solved. "Relieved?" Eleanor's voice rose for the first time. "You thought I'd be relieved to discover that my own daughter has been treating me like some pathetic old woman who can't manage her own affairs? You thought I'd be happy to learn that you've been lying to me for months, sneaking around, making me look foolish in front of doctors and hospital staff?" The accusations came faster now, building momentum like a storm gathering strength. Sarah recognized the pattern from countless similar scenes throughout her life. Eleanor would work herself into a state of righteous indignation, listing grievances both real and imagined, until Sarah was overwhelmed by guilt and desperate to make amends. But this time felt different. This time, Sarah had actually been trying to help in a meaningful way, and she had succeeded. Eleanor's medical bills were paid. Her credit rating was protected. The financial stress that had been affecting her recovery was eliminated. These were objective improvements to Eleanor's situation, regardless of her emotional response to how they had been achieved. For the first time in their relationship, Sarah felt the stirring of something that might have been anger rather than guilt. Not the hot, explosive anger that led to shouting matches, but a cold, clear recognition that Eleanor's response to genuine help revealed something fundamental about their dynamic that Sarah had never fully acknowledged. Eleanor was more comfortable being a victim than being helped. This realization settled over Sarah like dawn breaking, illuminating aspects of their relationship she had never seen clearly. Eleanor's health crises that coincided with Sarah's attempts at independence. Her suspicion of the very help she claimed to need. her talent for transforming solutions into new problems, her inability to express gratitude without resentment. Sarah looked at her mother sitting across the table, surrounded by evidence of her daughter's love and support, and saw clearly for the first time that Eleanor wasn't angry because she had been helped inappropriately. Eleanor was angry because she had been helped successfully. And successful help meant she couldn't continue being the martyr in their relationship. The silence stretched between them as Sarah processed this understanding. Eleanor was waiting for the usual response, the apologies and promises to do better, the acceptance of guilt and the negotiation of penance. But this time, Sarah found herself unable to summon the familiar feelings of shame and inadequacy that had always driven her compliance. Instead, she felt something she had never experienced in this kitchen, the quiet confidence that comes from knowing you've done the right thing for the right reasons, regardless of whether it's appreciated. Eleanor sensed the shift in dynamic before Sarah fully understood it herself. Her expression changed from righteous anger to something more calculating, more desperate. She was losing control of the narrative, and like all skilled manipulators, she instinctively escalated her tactics. "You think you're so clever," Eleanor said, her voice dropping to the whisper she used for her observations. "Sneaking around, playing the generous daughter when we both know the truth. You're just trying to buy your way out of your real responsibilities. Pay a few bills and think that makes up for all the ways you've let me down over the years?" The attack was perfectly aimed at Sarah's deepest insecurities, the fear that she was inherently selfish, that her love for her mother wasn't genuine enough. It should have worked. For 32 years, this kind of emotional precision strike had been sufficient to reduce Sarah to tears and compliance. But something had shifted. Maybe it was the sheer unfairness of being criticized for solving a problem. Maybe it was the exhaustion of 3 decades of emotional whiplash. Or maybe it was simply that Sarah had finally developed enough professional success and personal confidence to recognize manipulation when she encountered it so blatantly. "What are my real responsibilities, Mom?" Sarah asked, her voice steady in a way that surprised them both. The question hung in the air like a challenge Eleanor hadn't expected to face. She had built their entire relationship on Sarah's acceptance of unlimited obligation, on the premise that a good daughter's duty was infinite and unquestionable. Being asked to define those responsibilities explicitly was like being asked to explain why the sky was blue, something so fundamental to her worldview that articulation felt impossible. Eleanor's hesitation lasted only a moment before she recovered her composure and launched into the speech that would shatter their relationship permanently and, unexpectedly, set them both free. "Your responsibilities?" Eleanor's voice grew stronger as she found her footing on familiar ground. "Your responsibility is to be here for me, to put my needs first instead of gallivanting around town playing businesswoman, to recognize that I sacrificed everything for you, gave up my own dreams to raise you after your father died, and the least you can do is show some appreciation instead of treating me like a burden you need to pay off to make yourself feel better." The word burden hit the air like a slap, and Sarah felt something inside her chest go very still. In all their arguments over the years, through all Eleanor's guilt campaigns and emotional manipulations, she had never used that particular word. She had called Sarah ungrateful, selfish, disappointing, and neglectful, but she had never called her a burden. Eleanor saw Sarah's reaction and interpreted it as vulnerability rather than the moment of clarity it actually was. She pressed her advantage with the skill of someone who had been perfecting emotional warfare for decades. "Yes, that's exactly what you are," Eleanor continued, her voice gaining momentum from what she perceived as Sarah's distress. "A burden. Always have been from the day you were born, requiring attention and money and sacrifices I wasn't prepared to make. Your father at least contributed something to this family before he left me to deal with everything alone. But you just take, and when you finally give something back, you do it in a way that makes me look pathetic." Sarah sat perfectly still, watching her mother's face as she spoke, and realized that Eleanor meant every word. This wasn't anger talking or temporary frustration. This was Eleanor's genuine assessment of their relationship, the truth she had been hiding behind decades of guilt-inducing manipulation. "I should have known better than to think you'd actually help when things got tough," Eleanor finished, her voice now trembling with what appeared to be genuine emotion. But I suppose I hoped that somewhere underneath all that selfishness, there might be a daughter who actually cared about her mother instead of just looking for ways to ease her own conscience. The kitchen fell silent except for the familiar hum of the refrigerator and the distant sound of traffic on Oak Street. Sarah looked at her mother, really looked at her, and saw clearly for the first time not the powerful figure who had controlled her life through guilt and emotional manipulation, but a frightened, bitter woman
Had confused love with control for so long that she could no longer recognize genuine care when it was offered. Something fundamental had broken in that moment, not just between them, but within Sarah herself. The last threads of obligation based on guilt rather than love had snapped cleanly, leaving behind something she had never experienced before: the freedom to choose her responses based on what she believed was right, rather than what was expected. Sarah stood up from the table, her movements calm and deliberate. She looked down at Eleanor, who was watching her with the calculating expression of someone trying to determine whether their emotional gambit had achieved the desired effect. "I understand," Sarah said quietly. Eleanor's face showed confusion. This wasn't the response she had been expecting. There were no tears, no apologies, no desperate promises to do better, just those two simple words that somehow carried more finality than years of arguments had ever achieved. "You understand what?" Eleanor asked, her voice uncertain for the first time in the conversation. Sarah picked up her purse from the counter and walked toward the kitchen door. When she reached it, she turned back to face her mother one final time. "I understand exactly what you think of me," Sarah said. "And I understand that no amount of help, support, or sacrifice will ever be enough to change that opinion. So I'm gonna stop trying." Eleanor's expression shifted from confusion to alarm as she realized that Sarah wasn't playing by the familiar rules of their dysfunctional dance. "What do you mean, stop trying? You can't just abandon your responsibilities because you don't like hearing the truth about yourself." Sarah felt a smile tugging at the corners of her mouth, not from humor, but from the strange lightness that comes with finally understanding a puzzle that has been confusing you for years. "I'm not abandoning anything, Mom. I'm just accepting your assessment of our relationship. If I'm truly a burden, then the kindest thing I can do for both of us is to remove that burden from your life." She opened the kitchen door and stepped onto the back porch, breathing deeply of the autumn air that suddenly smelled like freedom. Behind her, she could hear Eleanor's voice rising in panic as she realized that her manipulation had backfired spectacularly. "Sarah, wait! You can't just leave. We need to talk about this properly. I didn't mean... You're taking this the wrong way." But Sarah was already walking toward her car, her steps steady and sure for the first time in 32 years. She had spent her entire adult life trying to earn love that was never freely given, trying to satisfy needs that were designed to remain forever unmet. Eleanor's cruel words had inadvertently given her the greatest gift possible: permission to stop trying. As she drove away from the house on Maple Street where she had grown up, Sarah felt something she had never experienced before. Not happiness exactly, but something quieter and more sustainable. She felt like herself, unfiltered by the constant need to manage someone else's emotions or compensate for someone else's disappointments. For the first time in her life, Sarah Mitchell was free to discover who she might be when she wasn't busy being a burden. The silence in Sarah's apartment felt different than it ever had before. Not the heavy, suffocating quiet that followed arguments with Eleanor, but something clean and spacious, like the moment after a storm passes and the air clears. She sat on her small couch, still wearing the clothes she had put on that morning when visiting her mother seemed like just another obligation to fulfill, and tried to process what had actually happened in that kitchen. Her phone had been ringing intermittently for the past hour. Eleanor, of course, calling with the persistence of someone who had never been denied the last word in an argument.
She let each call go to voicemail, not ready to hear whatever new manipulation was being crafted to draw her back into the familiar cycle of guilt and compliance. She would listen to the messages eventually, but not tonight.
Tonight belonged to her. The apartment felt larger somehow, as if removing Eleanor's emotional weight from her life had created physical space as well. Sarah walked through her two small rooms, seeing them clearly for perhaps the first time since she had moved in 3 years ago. The furniture was sparse but comfortable, chosen for function rather than style. Her computer setup dominated one corner of the living room, 2 monitors and a high-end processor that could handle the complex programming projects that had become her specialty. Books lined makeshift shelves along one wall, mostly technical manuals and programming guides, but also a few novels she had bought but never found time to read. This was her life, she realized. Not the half-life she had been living, split between professional competence and personal inadequacy, but her actual life. The work she loved, the skills she had developed despite every obstacle, the small comforts she had chosen for herself. It was modest, but it was hers. And for the first time since moving out of Eleanor's house, she didn't feel guilty about that ownership. Her laptop chimed with an email notification, and Sarah almost ignored it, assuming it was another client inquiry that could wait until morning. But the sender's name made her pause. Dr. Jennifer Walsh from Millbrook Community Health Center, Eleanor's primary care physician. Sarah opened the email with a mix of curiosity and dread, wondering if Eleanor had somehow managed to involve her doctor in their argument. But the message was brief and professional, requesting a meeting to discuss Eleanor's care plan and specifically mentioning concerns about her support system and stress management. The irony was immediate and bitter. For months, Sarah had been Eleanor's primary support system, managing medications, attending appointments, coordinating care, and ultimately paying for treatments. Now, apparently, the medical team was concerned about Eleanor's lack of support, unaware that she had just systematically destroyed the very relationship that had been sustaining her. Sarah closed the laptop without responding to the email. Let Eleanor explain to Dr. Walsh why her daughter was no longer available to provide the support she had been taking for granted. Let her navigate the medical system alone, the way she claimed she wanted to. Sarah had spent years anticipating Eleanor's needs, solving problems before they became crises, and managing logistics that Eleanor never even realized required management. Now Eleanor would discover exactly how much support she had been receiving and rejecting simultaneously. The next morning brought a new kind of routine. Sarah woke up naturally rather than to the sound of her phone ringing with Eleanor's morning medical reports. She made coffee in her small kitchen and checked her work email without the underlying anxiety about what family crisis might interrupt her professional obligations. The Peterson manufacturing project was entering its final phase, and she had client calls scheduled throughout the day. For the first time in months, she could focus entirely on her work without mental energy diverted to managing Eleanor's emotional state. The morning passed productively. Sarah completed debugging a complex inventory tracking module and responded to client questions with the kind of focused attention that had built her reputation in Millbrook's business community. Around noon, her phone rang with a number she didn't recognize. Sarah Mitchell, this is Detective Rodriguez with the Millbrook Police Department. I'm calling about a welfare check request for Eleanor Mitchell. Are you her daughter? Sarah's stomach clenched with familiar dread, the automatic assumption that something terrible had happened and she would somehow be responsible for not preventing it. Yes, I'm her daughter. Is she okay? She's fine, ma'am. She called us this morning requesting a welfare check because she said she hadn't heard from you in over 24 hours and was concerned about your well-being. Went to your listed address, your neighbors confirmed you were home and appeared to be fine. Mrs. Mitchell seemed confused about why you weren't answering her calls. Sarah closed her eyes, recognizing Eleanor's latest strategy. Unable to manipulate Sarah directly, she was now involving outside authorities to create pressure and establish a narrative of Sarah as an irresponsible daughter who had disappeared without explanation. I'm sorry you were bothered with this, Detective Rodriguez. I'm perfectly fine. I had an argument with my mother yesterday and chose not to take her phone calls last night. That's not typically considered a police matter. No, ma'am, it's not. But your mother seemed genuinely distressed, and she mentioned that you've been under a lot of stress lately, something about financial problems and family obligations. She was worried you might have, well, that you might have done something to hurt yourself. The manipulation was breathtaking in its sophistication. Eleanor had managed to paint Sarah as both potentially suicidal and financially irresponsible to law enforcement, creating a scenario where any attempt Sarah made to maintain boundaries would seem like evidence of instability. It was manipulation with official witnesses, designed to make Sarah appear unreasonable for wanting space from her mother. Detective, I can assure you that I'm not suicidal, not having financial problems, and not missing. I'm a grown woman who chose not to speak to her mother for one day after a difficult conversation. If my mother calls you again with concerns about my well-being, you can refer her to this conversation as evidence that I'm competent and safe. Understood, Miss Mitchell. And just so you know, we've had a few calls from your mother over the past several months. Concerns about potential fraud related to medical bills, suspicious activity in her neighborhood, things like that. Nothing that required action, but she does seem to be dealing with some anxiety. Sarah thanked the detective and hung up, her anger crystallizing into something harder and more determined than she had felt the day before. Eleanor wasn't just continuing their private family dysfunction. She was now actively trying to create public consequences for Sarah's attempt to establish boundaries. The medical bill investigation, the private detective, and now involving police in their personal conflict, showed a level of escalation that Sarah had never anticipated. But instead of feeling intimidated, Sarah found herself feeling something unexpected: relief. For the first time, Eleanor's manipulation tactics were being directed at people who weren't emotionally invested in maintaining family peace. Detective Rodriguez had clearly recognized the call as inappropriate use of police resources. Dr. Walsh would soon discover that Eleanor's lack of support was actually rejection of extensive support. The private investigator had simply documented what Sarah had never hidden, that she was financially successful enough to help with medical expenses. Eleanor's desperate attempts to control the narrative were actually exposing the dysfunction to neutral observers who could see the situation clearly. Sarah was no longer the only witness to Eleanor's manipulation. Now there were professionals who could document the pattern objectively. Her phone rang again, this time with Eleanor's number. Sarah let it go to voicemail, but when it rang immediately again, and then a third time, she decided to answer. The conversation needed to happen eventually, and Eleanor's escalation to involving police suggested she wasn't going to simply accept Sarah's withdrawal gracefully. "Hello, Mom." "Sarah, thank God. I've been so worried about you. When you didn't answer my calls, I thought something terrible might have happened. You know how I worry when we leave things unsettled between us." Eleanor's voice carried the tremulous quality she used when positioning herself as the concerned, loving mother rather than the manipulative controller. Sarah recognized the tone from decades of similar conversations, but hearing it now, after everything that had happened, felt like watching a magic trick after someone had explained how it worked. "I'm fine, Mom. I just needed some time to think." "Think about what, sweetheart?" "I know I was upset yesterday, but you have to understand how shocked I was to learn about the medical bills. I never meant to hurt your feelings." The revisionist history was beginning already. Eleanor's cruel words about Sarah being a burden were being reframed as mere upset, her systematic rejection of help being repositioned as simple shock. Sarah had seen this pattern countless times. Eleanor would say something devastating, then gradually modify the story until she became the victim of Sarah's oversensitivity. "You said I was a burden, Mom. You said I always had been from the day I was born." "Oh, honey, I was just frustrated. You know I don't really feel that way. I was hurt that you hadn't told me about paying those bills, and I said things I didn't mean. We both know how emotional I get when I'm not feeling well." Eleanor's ability to minimize her own cruelty while maximizing Sarah's responsibility to forgive was masterful. The "you know I don't really feel that way" was particularly skillful, placing the burden on Sarah to accept that Eleanor's explicitly stated feelings were somehow inauthentic, while her claims of love should be taken at face value. "Actually, Mom, I think you meant exactly what you said, and I think it was probably the most honest conversation we've had in years." Eleanor's pause was brief, but telling. She had expected the usual dance of guilt and reconciliation, not this calm acceptance of her stated position. "Sarah, you're being ridiculous. Of course I didn't mean those things. You're my daughter. I love you more than anything. But you have to admit that the way you handled those medical bills was secretive and manipulative. It made me feel like you don't trust me to make my own decisions about my own life." The accusation of manipulation was particularly rich, coming from someone who had spent the previous day calling police for a welfare check on her adult daughter. But Sarah recognized the strategy. Eleanor was trying to establish a false equivalence where Sarah's anonymous help was comparable to Eleanor's systematic emotional control. "You're right that I didn't trust you to make good decisions about the medical bills," Sarah said. "I knew that if I offered to help directly, you would refuse and then spend months making me feel guilty about your financial stress. So I found a way to solve the problem without giving you an opportunity to reject the help and blame me for not offering it." "That's not fair, Sarah. I would have been grateful for your help." "Mom, when have you ever been grateful for my help without also making me feel bad about needing to provide it? When have you ever let me solve a problem for you without finding something wrong with my solution?" Eleanor's silence stretched long enough that Sarah wondered if the call had been disconnected. When she finally spoke, her voice had shifted from manipulative sweetness to something harder and more honest. "I don't like feeling helpless, Sarah. I don't like needing things from people, especially from my own daughter. It makes me feel like I've failed as a mother and as an adult." For a moment, Sarah felt the flicker of the old sympathy, the automatic urge to reassure Eleanor and minimize her own needs in service of Eleanor's emotional comfort. But the feeling passed quickly, replaced by a clearer understanding of what Eleanor had actually revealed. "So you'd rather I struggle and feel guilty than accept help gracefully? You'd rather we both be miserable than admit that sometimes people need support from the people who love them?" "That's not what I'm saying." "That's exactly what you're saying, Mom. You're saying that your pride is more important than my peace of mind, and that you'd rather punish me for helping than deal with your own discomfort about needing help." Eleanor's voice turned sharp again, the brief moment of vulnerability closing like a door. "Don't you dare lecture me about pride, Sarah. You've been throwing money around like it makes up for all
Ways you've neglected your real responsibilities to this family. What responsibilities exactly? I've been paying your bills, managing your medical care, rearranging my work schedule around your appointments, and providing emotional support for every crisis you've had for the past 15 years. What else should I be doing? You should be here, present, available when I need you, instead of hiding behind your computer all day, playing with numbers, and pretending you're too important to spend time with your own mother." The accusation stung because it contained just enough truth to feel believable. Sarah did spend long hours working, and she had been grateful for the legitimate excuse to limit her time at Eleanor's house, but the characterization of her work as playing with numbers revealed something important about how Eleanor viewed Sarah's professional success. "My work isn't playing, Mom. It's a career that I built despite every obstacle you put in my way. It's how I earn the money that pays for the help you claim to need but refuse to accept gracefully. I never asked you to pay my bills. You've been asking me to pay your bills for 15 years. You just preferred it when I did it in smaller amounts that didn't threaten your narrative about being self-sufficient." Eleanor's laugh was harsh and familiar. "Self-sufficient? I haven't been self-sufficient since your father died and left me to raise a child on my own with no support from anyone." "You had support, Mom. You had me. But instead of treating me like family who wanted to help, you treated me like a resource to be managed and a disappointment to be corrected."
I treated you like a daughter who needed guidance and structure. Just because you didn't like hearing the truth about your shortcomings doesn't mean I was wrong to point them out. Sarah realized that they were approaching the heart of their dysfunction, the fundamental disagreement about what their relationship should look like. Eleanor saw herself as the authority figure whose job was to identify and correct Sarah's flaws. Sarah wanted a relationship between equals who supported each other's growth and success. Mom, what would I have to do for you to be proud of me instead of constantly disappointed? The question hung in the air for so long that Sarah wondered if Eleanor was actually considering it seriously. When she finally answered, her words carried the weight of years of accumulated resentment. I would need to feel like you actually wanted to be part of this family instead of treating us like an obligation you're trying to minimize. I would need to see you putting our relationship first instead of always looking for ways to escape from it. And what does putting our relationship first look like to you? It looks like being available when I need you without making me feel guilty for needing anything. It looks like including me in your decisions instead of sneaking around behind my back. It looks like showing some appreciation for the sacrifices I made to raise you instead of acting like everything I did was wrong. Sarah felt a familiar sadness settling over her, the grief that comes from recognizing that someone you love has created conditions for a relationship that make genuine connection impossible. Eleanor's definition of putting their relationship first required Sarah to abandon her own judgment, professional obligations, and personal boundaries. It required her to become a different person entirely. Mom, what you're describing isn't a relationship between a mother and an adult daughter. It's a relationship between a parent and a dependent child. I can't go back to being 12 years old just because that's when you felt most comfortable with our dynamic. I'm not asking you to be 12 years old. I'm asking you to be a daughter who actually cares about her mother's well-being. I do care about your well-being. That's why I paid your medical bills. That's why I've spent years rearranging my life around your needs. But caring about your well-being can't require me to sacrifice my well-being indefinitely. Eleanor's voice grew cold with the finality Sarah had learned.
Recognize as the prelude to emotional cutoff. I see. So this is really about you feeling sorry for yourself, instead of recognizing that family means making sacrifices for each other. Family does mean making sacrifices for each other, Mom, but it should be mutual. I've been making sacrifices for 15 years. What sacrifices have you made for me? The silence that followed was answer enough. Eleanor had never considered Sarah's well-being as something worth sacrificing for, never adjusted her expectations to accommodate Sarah's needs, never modified her behavior to support Sarah's growth or happiness. She had extracted sacrifice without offering it, demanded support without providing it, and expected gratitude for the privilege of serving someone who viewed that service as inadequate, regardless of its scope. I sacrificed my entire adult life to raise you after your father died, Eleanor finally said, her voice tight with indignation. You were 39 when Dad died, Mom. You had decades of adult life ahead of you. You chose to spend those decades focused on controlling my life instead of building your own. That wasn't sacrifice for my benefit. That was using me as an excuse to avoid creating your own purpose and identity. The accusation was harsher than anything Sarah had ever said to Eleanor directly, and she immediately felt the familiar urge to soften it, to apologize for being too honest. But she forced herself to sit with the discomfort of having spoken a truth that needed to be said. Eleanor's response came in the tone of voice Sarah had learned to fear most as a child, deadly quiet and precise as a surgical instrument. How dare you speak to me that way? After everything I've done for you, after all the years I've put your needs first, this is how you repay me? By telling me that I wasted my life raising an ungrateful child who thinks she knows better than the woman who sacrificed everything for her? You didn't put my needs first, Mom. You put your need to control me first. There's a difference. I'm done with this conversation, Sarah. When you're ready to apologize for your behavior and have a real discussion about how to repair the damage you've caused to our relationship, you can call me. Until then, I have nothing more to say to you. The line went dead, leaving Sarah holding her phone in the sudden silence of her apartment. She recognized the pattern.
Eleanor was implementing one of her strategic withdrawals designed to make Sarah desperate for reconciliation and willing to accept all blame for their conflict in exchange for restoration of communication. But this time, Sarah felt no desperation. Instead, she felt something like relief mixed with sadness. The complex emotion that comes with finally understanding that a relationship you've been trying to save may not be worth saving in its current form. She set the phone down and returned to her computer, where the Peterson project awaited her attention. The code was clean and logical. Problems had solutions, and success was measured by objective results rather than someone else's emotional satisfaction. It was a world where competence was valued and effort produced predictable outcomes. As she worked, Sarah found herself thinking about Dr. Walsh's email and the request to discuss Eleanor's support system. Perhaps it was time for Eleanor's medical team to understand exactly what that support system had looked like and why it was no longer available. Not as revenge, but as honest communication about the reality of their situation. Sarah opened a new email and began typing a response to Dr. Walsh, requesting a meeting to discuss her mother's care needs and the family dynamics that would affect future support planning. It was time for professionals to understand what they were dealing with when they made recommendations about Eleanor's stress management and family involvement. For the first time in her adult life, Sarah was going to tell the complete truth about her relationship with her mother to someone in a position to make informed decisions about Eleanor's care. The conversation would be difficult, but it would also be liberating.
Was done protecting Eleanor's public image at the expense of her own well-being. If Eleanor wanted to be independent, she could learn what independence actually looked like when it wasn't subsidized by a daughter's silent sacrifices. The afternoon passed quietly, productively, and for the first time in years without a single interruption from family drama. Sarah completed her work, made dinner for one, and spent the evening reading one of the novels she had been too busy to open for months. When she went to bed that night, her phone had recorded 6 more missed calls from Eleanor, but Sarah felt no urgency to respond. Tomorrow she would begin the work of building a life that wasn't organized around managing someone else's emotions. Tomorrow, she would discover what freedom actually felt like. Dr. Jennifer Walsh's office was nothing like the sterile medical environment Sarah had grown accustomed to during Eleanor's various health crises. The space felt more like a comfortable living room, with warm lighting, plants on the windowsill, and family photos scattered across the desk that suggested Dr. Walsh understood something about the complexities of family relationships. Sarah had arrived 15 minutes early for their appointment, using the extra time to organize her thoughts and prepare for what she knew would be a difficult but necessary conversation. When Dr. Walsh entered, she was younger than Sarah had expected, probably in her early 40s, with kind eyes and the sort of calm demeanor that suggested she had heard every possible variation of family dysfunction during her years in family medicine. She greeted Sarah warmly and settled into her chair with a tablet and a thick folder that Sarah recognized as Eleanor's medical records. "Thank you for coming in, Sarah. I know this is unusual, but I felt it was important to have a conversation about your mother's overall health picture, particularly her stress levels and support system. She's mentioned you frequently during our appointments, and it's clear that you play a significant role in her care." Sarah felt the familiar tightness in her chest that accompanied any discussion of her role in Eleanor's life, but this time it was tempered by determination to be completely honest about their family dynamics. "I'm glad you reached out, Dr. Walsh. I think there are some things about our family situation that might be relevant to Mom's care that you may not be aware of." Dr. Walsh nodded encouragingly. "I'd very much like to hear your perspective. Your mother has described some recent changes in her support system, and she seems quite distressed about what she characterizes as increasing isolation and family conflict. She's also mentioned some concerns about financial stress, though she's been somewhat vague about the details." The irony was immediate and bitter. Eleanor was apparently describing herself as isolated and financially stressed to her doctor, while simultaneously rejecting the support that would address both issues. Sarah took a deep breath and decided to start with the most recent events. "Dr. Walsh, I need to tell you that my mother and I had a significant argument 3 days ago, and we haven't spoken since then. The argument was about the fact that I had been anonymously paying her medical bills for the past several months, something she discovered through hiring a private investigator."
Dr. Walsh's eyebrows rose slightly, but her expression remained professionally neutral. Can you tell me more about that situation? Sarah explained the circumstances that had led her decision to pay Eleanor's bills anonymously, the stress Eleanor had exhibited about the mounting costs, and her own desire to remove that financial burden without triggering Eleanor's typical resistance to accepting help. She described Eleanor's reaction to discovering the payments, including the accusation that Sarah was being manipulative, and the devastating conversation that had ended with Eleanor calling her daughter a burden. "I see," Dr. Walsh said thoughtfully, making notes on her tablet. "And you mentioned this wasn't the first time you've provided
Financial support. I've been contributing to my mother's household expenses and medical costs for over 15 years, Sarah said. Not just the recent bills, but regularly, consistently, and often at significant personal sacrifice. My mother has a pattern of expressing distress about financial issues while simultaneously refusing direct offers of help. So I've learned to provide support in ways that don't give her opportunities to reject it and then blame me for not offering." Dr. Walsh set down her tablet and leaned forward slightly. "Sarah, that sounds like an exhausting dynamic to navigate. Can you help me understand how this pattern developed?" For the next 30 minutes, Sarah found herself telling the story of her relationship with Eleanor to someone who listened without judgment and asked clarifying questions that helped her see patterns she had never articulated before. She described Eleanor's reaction to her college scholarship, the gradual erosion of her independence through manufactured crises, the years of guilt campaigns that had shaped every major decision in her adult life. "It sounds like you've been managing not just financial support, but emotional management as well," Dr. Walsh observed. "How has this affected your own life and well-being?" The question was simple, but it was the first time anyone in a professional capacity had asked about Sarah's well-being in the context of her caregiving role. The recognition that her experience mattered, that her perspective was valuable, brought unexpected tears to her eyes. "It's been incredibly difficult," Sarah admitted. "I've built a successful career, but I've never been able to fully invest in my own life because I'm always waiting for the next crisis that will require me to drop everything and focus on my mother's needs. And no matter how much I help or how much I sacrifice, it's never enough. There's always something I should be doing better or differently." Dr. Walsh nodded knowingly. "What you're describing sounds like a caregiver relationship that lacks healthy boundaries. It's unfortunately common in families where one person's emotional needs become the organizing principle for everyone else's decisions." The clinical terminology for what Sarah had experienced provided a strange comfort. It meant that her experience wasn't unique, that there were other people who had struggled with similar dynamics, and most importantly, that the problem had a name and potential solutions. "Dr. Walsh, can I ask you something? My mother told me during our argument that she's been discussing our family situation with you. What has she said about our relationship and my role in her care?" Dr. Walsh consulted her notes carefully before responding. "Your mother has consistently described you as very busy with work commitments and often unavailable when she needs support. She's expressed feeling like she's become a burden to you and that you seem resentful about having to help with her medical care. She's also mentioned concerns that you're financially overextended and taking on more than you can handle out of guilt about your father's death." Sarah stared at Dr. Walsh in stunned silence. Every element of Eleanor's narrative to her doctor was not just inaccurate, but the complete inverse of reality. Eleanor had positioned herself as the concerned mother worried about her daughter's well-being, while painting Sarah as the reluctant, overwhelmed caregiver who was failing to provide adequate support. "Dr. Walsh, that's almost entirely false. I've attended virtually every medical appointment with her for the past 2 years. I've coordinated her care, managed her medications, arranged transportation, and handled insurance issues. I've been financially supporting her since my father died, not out of guilt, but out of love and responsibility. And I've never once expressed resentment about helping with her medical care.
though I have tried to set some boundaries around her emotional demands." Dr. Walsh studied Sarah's face carefully. "You seem surprised by how your mother has characterized your involvement in her care."
Happening in our relationship. That's not uncommon in complex family dynamics, Dr. Welsh said gently. Sometimes people's perception of relationships can be significantly different from objective reality, particularly when stress, illness, and longstanding family patterns are involved. Sarah felt something shifting inside her chest, a fundamental realignment of understanding that was both painful and liberating. Eleanor hadn't just been manipulating her privately, she had been creating an alternative narrative about their relationship for public consumption, one that positioned her as the victim of Sarah's inadequate care while erasing all evidence of her actual contributions. Dr. Walsh, I need you to understand something. When my mother tells you that I'm unavailable or that she feels like a burden to me, she's not describing her actual experience. She's describing the experience she wishes she was having because it supports her preferred narrative about our relationship. Can you elaborate on that? Sarah took a deep breath, organizing years of observations into a coherent explanation. My mother has been most comfortable in our relationship when she can position herself as the martyr who sacrifices for an ungrateful child, or as the victim who suffers because of an inadequate daughter. When I provide support effectively, it disrupts that narrative. She can't be the neglected mother if her daughter is successfully meeting her needs, so she either rejects the support or reframes it as insufficient or inappropriate. Dr. Walsh made notes while Sarah continued. The financial support is a perfect example. I've been preventing her from experiencing financial stress for months, but instead of acknowledging that support, she's told you that she's financially stressed and I'm overextended. The anonymous payments allowed her to maintain her victim narrative while still receiving the help she needed. And when she discovered that you had been making those payments, she was furious, but not because I had violated her autonomy or treated her disrespectfully. She was furious because I had solved her problem in a way that didn't give her an opportunity to reject the help and blame me for not providing it. The anonymous payments disrupted her ability to use financial stress as a weapon in our relationship. Dr. Walsh set down her pen and looked at Sarah directly. Sarah, what you're describing sounds like a pattern of emotional manipulation that's been ongoing for many years. How do you think this dynamic has affected your mother's overall health and well-being? The question forced Sarah to consider something she had never thought about before: the possibility that Eleanor's physical symptoms might be connected to the emotional dysfunction in their relationship. She had always assumed that family stress was simply an unfortunate side effect of Eleanor's legitimate health problems, but Dr. Walsh seemed to be suggesting a more complex relationship between Eleanor's emotional patterns and her medical complaints. I think my mother's health problems are real, Sarah said carefully, but I also think she's discovered that medical crises are very effective at getting my immediate and complete attention. When I start to establish boundaries or focus on my own life, she tends to have episodes that require me to drop everything and take care of her. Has she had any serious medical emergencies during times when you were trying to become more independent? Sarah thought back over the years, and the pattern became uncomfortably clear. Eleanor's first major asthma attack had occurred the week before Sarah's scholarship deadline. Her mysterious back problems had coincided with Sarah's attempt to take evening classes. Her gallbladder surgery, while genuinely necessary, had happened during Sarah's most important professional project and had somehow required much more intensive caregiving than the doctors had initially indicated would be necessary. Yes, Said quietly. Almost every time I've tried to prioritize my own goals or establish some independence, my mother has had a health crisis that required me to refocus on her needs. Dr. Walsh nodded grimly. What you're describing is unfortunately not uncommon. Some people, often unconsciously, develop physical symptoms during times of emotional stress or perceived abandonment. The symptoms are real and require medical attention, but the timing and severity can be influenced by psychological factors. Are you saying my mother makes herself sick to control me? I'm saying that stress, anxiety, and relationship conflicts can manifest as physical symptoms, and those symptoms can become a way of communicating needs or maintaining relationship dynamics. Your mother may not be consciously manipulating her health, but her body may be responding to emotional distress in ways that have the effect of bringing you back into a caregiving role. The explanation made horrible sense. Eleanor had learned, perhaps without conscious awareness, that medical crises were more effective than direct communication at getting Sarah's attention and compliance. Physical symptoms couldn't be argued with or dismissed the way emotional demands could be. They created objective needs that required immediate response and generated guilt if ignored. Dr. Walsh, if this pattern continues, what happens to my mother's health long term? That's a complex question, Dr. Walsh replied. Chronic stress and unresolved emotional conflicts can definitely impact physical health over time. But the more immediate concern is that your mother seems to have developed a relationship with illness that serves psychological functions beyond just addressing medical problems. Until she can find healthier ways to communicate her emotional needs and manage relationship conflicts, she may continue to experience stress-related symptoms. And what about my role in all of this? Am I helping her by continuing to provide care the way I have been? Or am I enabling a dysfunctional pattern? Dr. Walsh considered the question carefully. Based on what you've told me, it sounds like you've been providing excellent practical support while enabling some unhealthy emotional dynamics. Your mother has learned that she can reject your help, blame you for not providing it, and still ultimately receive the support she needs because you'll find ways to provide it regardless of her response. The assessment stung because it was accurate. Sarah had indeed been enabling Eleanor's rejection of help by making sure the help happened anyway, just in forms that Eleanor couldn't directly refuse. She had been so focused on solving Eleanor's practical problems that she had inadvertently reinforced Eleanor's belief that she could maintain her victim narrative while still receiving all the benefits of Sarah's support. What would healthy boundaries look like in this situation? Sarah asked. Healthy boundaries would mean being clear about what support you're willing to provide and under what conditions, and then following through consistently. It would mean not rescuing your mother from the natural consequences of rejecting help and not accepting responsibility for managing her emotional responses to those consequences. Wouldn't that be cruel, though? If she needs help and I can provide it, shouldn't I do that regardless of how she responds? Sarah, there's a difference between helping someone and enabling them to avoid dealing with their own emotional issues. If your mother is capable of making decisions about her own care, then she's also capable of accepting the consequences of those decisions. Protecting her from those consequences doesn't help her grow or change. It just maintains the status quo. Dr. Walsh's words settled over Sarah like a new understanding of what love and responsibility actually meant. She had been confusing enabling with caring, confusing rescue with support, confusing Eleanor's comfort with Eleanor's well-being. Dr. Walsh, my mother and I had a conversation 3 days ago where she called me
a burden and told me I always had been. At the time, I felt like it was the cruelest thing she could have said, but now I'm wondering if it was actually the most honest thing she's ever told me about how she sees our relationship. What do you think she meant when she called you a burden? Sarah considered the question carefully. I think she meant that my existence has required her to be responsible for someone other than herself, and she's resented that responsibility for my entire life. But instead of acknowledging that resentment directly, she's created a narrative where I'm the one who's inadequate and she's the one who's sacrificing.
That's a very mature and insightful analysis, Dr. Walsh said. How does understanding that change how you want to handle your relationship with your mother going forward? I think it means I need to stop trying to earn love that isn't freely given and stop providing support to someone who resents receiving it. If my mother sees me as a burden, then the kindest thing I can do for both of us is to stop imposing that burden on her. Dr. Walsh made final notes and then looked up at Sarah with something that might have been admiration. Sarah, I want you to know that what you've shared with me today has given me a much clearer understanding of your mother's situation and needs. It's obvious that you've been providing exceptional care under very difficult circumstances, and it's equally obvious that the current dynamic isn't sustainable for either of you. What will you tell my mother about our conversation? I'll tell her that I met with you to discuss her care needs and that we talked about family dynamics and stress management. I'll recommend that she consider counseling to help her develop better coping strategies and communication skills, and I'll be much more direct with her about the need to take responsibility for her own healthcare decisions and their consequences. Sarah felt a weight lifting from her shoulders that she hadn't even realized she had been carrying. For the first time in years, someone in a position of authority had a complete and accurate picture of her family situation. Eleanor would no longer be able to manipulate medical professionals with partial truths about their relationship. Dr. Walsh, there's one more thing I need to tell you. I've decided that I can't continue providing support the way I have been. I'm going to step back from regular caregiving and let my mother experience what it's actually like to manage her health independently. I want you to know this isn't abandonment. It's an attempt to create a healthier dynamic for both of us. I think that's a wise decision, Dr. Walsh said. And I want you to know that you're not responsible for your mother's reaction to those boundaries. She's an adult who's capable of making her own decisions about her care and her relationships. As Sarah left Dr. Walsh's office, she felt something she had never experienced before: the confidence that comes from having an authority figure validate your perceptions and support your decisions. She was no longer the only person who understood the true dynamics of her relationship with Eleanor. The drive home took her past Eleanor's house on Maple Street, and Sarah found herself slowing down as she approached the familiar driveway. Eleanor's car was there, and the living room lights were on, creating the warm glow that had always meant home during her childhood. For a moment, she felt the old pull of guilt and obligation, the automatic urge to stop and check on Eleanor's well-being. But she drove past without stopping, recognizing that her presence would only perpetuate the cycle they had been trapped in for decades. Eleanor needed to experience the reality of independence she claimed to want, and Sarah needed to discover what her own life looked like when it wasn't organized around managing someone else's emotions. That evening, Sarah's phone rang several times with Eleanor's number, but she let each call go to voicemail. When she finally listened to the messages before bed, they followed a predictable pattern: concern about Sarah's well-being, expressions of love and regret, subtle blame for the current situation, and increasingly desperate attempts to reestablish contact. The final message was different, though. Eleanor's voice was flat and tired rather than manipulative, and her words carried a resignation Sarah had never heard before. Sarah, I know you're angry with me, and maybe you have a right to be. I've been thinking about what you said, about me never being grateful for your help, and I suppose there's some truth to that. I don't know how to need things from people without feeling ashamed of the needing. I don't know how to accept help without feeling like it makes me weak. And I don't know how to admit that I've been taking out my own disappointments on the person who's been trying hardest to help me. I'm going to talk to Dr. Walsh about counseling, like she suggested. I don't know if it's too late to change things between us, but I think I need to try to change things about myself first. I hope you're taking care of yourself, sweetheart. You deserve better than what I've been giving you. Sarah stared at her phone in shock. In 32 years, she had never heard Eleanor take responsibility for their relationship problems without immediately minimizing that responsibility or blaming Sarah for forcing her to acknowledge it. The message wasn't an apology exactly, but it was something closer to honesty than Eleanor had ever managed before. She set the phone aside without calling back, recognizing that Eleanor's moment of clarity didn't erase decades of dysfunction and didn't obligate Sarah to immediately return to their previous dynamic. Real change would require sustained effort over time, not just one moment of insight delivered in a voicemail message. Over the following weeks, Sarah gradually built a new routine that didn't include daily management of Eleanor's medical and emotional needs. She threw herself into her work with the kind of focused energy she hadn't been able to sustain in years. The Peterson project was completed ahead of schedule and under budget, leading to referrals for 3 additional major contracts. Sarah found herself building the kind of professional reputation she had always dreamed of, but never had the mental bandwidth to pursue. She also began to discover aspects of herself that had been submerged during her years of intensive caregiving. She joined a hiking group that met on weekends, something she had never had time for when weekends were reserved for Eleanor's needs. She took a painting class at the community college, reconnecting with the artistic interests she had abandoned when Eleanor declared them selfish and impractical. She even went on a few dates with a software engineer she met through professional networking, experiencing for the first time what it felt like to build a relationship with someone who didn't need to be rescued or managed. Eleanor, meanwhile, was apparently experiencing her own process of discovery. According to the occasional updates Sarah received through mutual acquaintances in Millbrook's small community, Eleanor had indeed started counseling and was reportedly working on what her therapist called developing autonomous coping strategies. She had also joined a senior center support group for people dealing with chronic health issues, something she had always refused to consider when Sarah suggested it. 2 months after their argument, Sarah received a letter in the mail, with Eleanor's familiar handwriting on the envelope. Inside was a brief note and a check for exactly the amount Sarah had spent on Eleanor's medical bills over the previous year. "Sarah," the note read, "Dr. Walsh helped me understand how much you've been doing for me that I never acknowledged or appreciated. I can't undo the things I said to you, but I can try to repay the financial support you've provided and take responsibility for my own expenses going forward. I'm learning in counseling that accepting help gracefully is a skill I never developed, and that my pride was more important to me than your peace of mind. That was wrong, and I'm working to change it.
Hope someday you'll be willing to have a conversation about what a healthier relationship between us might look like. But I understand if you need more time or if you decide that's not possible. You were never a burden, sweetheart. You were the best thing in my life. And I'm sorry it took me so long to be able to say that. Love, Mom." Sarah held the letter and check for a long time, feeling the complex mixture of emotions that comes with receiving the acknowledgement you've always wanted but never expected. Eleanor's words were everything Sarah had hoped to hear for decades, but they came at a time when Sarah had finally stopped needing to hear them in order to feel valuable and worthy of love. She deposited the check and wrote a brief response, thanking Eleanor for the gesture and expressing cautious optimism about the possibility of rebuilding their relationship on healthier terms. But she was careful not to rush back into their old patterns, recognizing that real change would need to be demonstrated over time rather than just expressed in moments of clarity. 6 months later, Sarah and Eleanor began having monthly dinners at a neutral restaurant, carefully structured meetings where they could practice new ways of relating to each other. Eleanor had indeed made significant progress in counseling, learning to identify and express her emotional needs directly rather than through manufactured crises. Sarah had learned to maintain her boundaries compassionately, but firmly, offering support without taking responsibility for Eleanor's emotional responses. Their relationship would never be the close, easy connection that Sarah had once hoped for, but it became something sustainable and honest. Eleanor learned to accept help gracefully, and Sarah learned to offer it without sacrificing her own well-being. Most importantly, they both learned that love could exist without control,
and that family relationships could be chosen and shaped rather than simply endured. Standing in her apartment one evening, almost a year after that devastating conversation in Eleanor's kitchen, Sarah reflected on how completely her life had changed. She had built a thriving business, developed friendships and interests that had nothing to do with caregiving, and created a relationship with her mother based on mutual respect rather than guilt and obligation. The greatest revelation hadn't been Eleanor's acknowledgement of her mistakes, though that had been healing. The greatest revelation had been Sarah's discovery that she could choose to love someone without accepting treatment that diminished her own worth. She could be a good daughter without being a perfect caregiver. She could maintain family relationships without sacrificing her individual identity. The phone rang, interrupting her thoughts, and Sarah smiled when she saw the caller ID showing her newest client, a startup company in Pittsburgh that wanted her to design their entire digital infrastructure. It was the kind of complex, challenging project she had always dreamed of, and for the first time in her adult life, she could accept it without worrying about how her professional commitments might conflict with family obligations. As she answered the call and began discussing technical specifications and project timelines, Sarah felt the quiet satisfaction that comes from building a life that reflects your own values and priorities rather than someone else's expectations. Eleanor had called her a burden, and in trying to hurt her, had accidentally given her the greatest gift possible, permission to discover who she really was when she wasn't busy being what someone else needed her to be. The burden Sarah had been carrying all her life hadn't been the financial support or practical caregiving she provided to Eleanor. The real burden had been the weight of unearned guilt, unrecognized resentment, and love that was conditional on perfect compliance with impossible demands. Setting down that burden hadn't made Sarah cruel or selfish, as she had always feared it would. Instead, it had made her free to love authentically, give generously without any expectation of recompense, and to create relationships with her own blueprint rather than inherit someone else's.
Without resentment, and build relationships based on mutual respect rather than emotional manipulation. She had learned that the most loving thing you can sometimes do for someone is to stop enabling their worst impulses and start requiring their best efforts. Eleanor was no longer a burden to be managed, but a person to be respected, capable of making her own decisions and accepting their consequences. And Sarah was no longer a daughter desperate for approval, but a woman confident in her own worth, generous with her love, but protective of her boundaries. The family they had built together in the aftermath of their crisis wasn't perfect, but it was honest. And for the first time in either of their lives, that felt like enough. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.